Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time to talk a little bit more about Avengers Endgame. This was going to be the full analysis. There will be spoilers in here. I already did a video with no spoilers, so if you still need information as to whether or not you ought to see this movie, please check this one out. Going further than this, I'm going to talk about lots of different story details, so that's what's in store here. As I mentioned in some other videos, it's actually very difficult to judge this movie the way that I normally judge movies, which is I tend to rate a bunch of different aspects of the movie and use those to determine a final score, a final judgment as to the quality of the movie. This includes production, story elements, and a general effect. The problem with Avengers Endgame is that it doesn't fit that mold. And if you were to fit it into that mold, the movie might seem worse than it actually is, because it's not really a movie. It's an experience. It's an capstone experience is what I called it. It's the end of the MCU. It's a final experience. It's a fan-focused experience. And as a result, it is missing some elements that you would expect to see in a movie, and it's packed with other things that don't necessarily contribute to what would be a coherent and impactful story if this movie were isolated and were not the final act, if you will, of a very long series of movies called the MCU. The main purpose of this movie is to provide for the fans all of the emotional closure that's necessary to say goodbye to certain characters. The characters that leave Captain America and Iron Man and Black Widow all have to have important emotional scenes that are tied in with their departure. They have to do with their character arc and their character arc coming to a final close before we exit this phase. Because the main phase here, this whatever you want to call it, the everything up to now, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I think they're going to start phase 4 now, however they're terming it. Has really been focused around Iron Man and Captain America and the machinations and the conflict between them and the different things that they are having to do to protect Earth and to form the Avengers. And so Avengers Endgame really focuses on those two, and then additionally Black Widow, and also provides a little bit of a type of closure for Hawkeye as well. And so that's really what I want to focus on, because that's the main goal of the movie. Now, I want to talk about a lot of the aspects of the movie that I would talk about in any other movie, production, that kind of stuff. But that's not the focus of this movie. This movie is not about effects. It's not about really great production values. It's not about a strict and coherent plot even. The plot is really there to create the scenes that are necessary for us to have that emotional release for those characters and to close out the entire MCU thus far. So why don't I start? I'll talk a little bit about production before I hop into the story, just to get the production out of the way. One of the things about the aesthetics in Avengers Endgame, it's the same thing with the previous Avengers movie. It's a little bit schizophrenic. I think schizophrenic was what I used for the previous one. I think I called it a schizophrenic fan service fiesta or something like that. When I say schizophrenic, I mean it's almost postmodern. Things don't mix well together. You have the outer space Guardians of the Galaxy thing. You have the modern ancient Asgard that's in there, and then you have Earth. You have Iron Man's aesthetics there. You have older aesthetics from Captain America and newer ones. You just have a big mixture of things with alien planets, Earth, spaceships, and it's so many different things. They don't quite gel together. In fact, they really don't gel together. They're quite different. And that's because each of these story areas, Guardians of the Galaxy, Iron Man, they are focused on different aesthetic systems. And so when you put them all together, you can see that they don't quite mix well together. That's, however, something that has to be done in order for the Avengers movie to exist. So once again, if I were to say that that's a bad thing, that has to happen. You have to have that in order to represent all of the movies, because one of the goals of the movie is to tie everything together that we've seen thus far. Can't tie it together unless you have those aesthetics existing side by side. So in some cases it's quite jarring, but that's one of the consequences of the movie itself. Likewise, the effects are good. The digital effects are good. The CGI is good. The special effects are good. It's a high quality Marvel production. I don't think it lags in any of them. Seeing it on the big screen, There are places where you can see the seams in the CGI or the way that the compositing works with the CGI and maybe the CGI background set and a live actor. There's some seams that you can see here and there if you're looking out for them. But for the most part, the CGI is on par with everything else that you see in the MCU. It's not worse, and it's not better. When it comes to things like special effects, when you don't notice them, that's usually better than if you do notice them. So it's a hard thing to rate. For the most part, I didn't notice any kind of problems with the special effects, but I was aware when things were, not real. But that's typical for virtually every movie that employs a lot of computer effects. The music, I think, was actually a low point of the production. The music was very, very boring. Now, it's effective, but it's your standard dissonance score. And with each Avengers movie, the score's gotten a little more, it's had more of its character kind of peeled out, and we end up with just a score that has big dissonant chords when there's times of tension, no real melodies that carry through the movie, no thematic use of anything. We don't even have like the scores from the previous movies really brought in for us to hear. And the reality is the MCU has never had music as a strong point. They've never had really strong thematic music. But there's, overall the music's effective and it does what it's supposed to do. I'd say it's subpar compared to my standards and probably subpar compared to the MCU, probably the weakest point of production, but not so weak that you're going to be annoyed by the music. So if I were to compare this to, say, Thor 3, the music was obnoxious at times. It was present. It was too present. In this case, the music's really too out of the way. And I think it's probably better to have a happy ground somewhere in the middle there. Next, sound design. Sound design's good. It's on par with everything else in the MCU. Likewise, the cinematography is also good. It's on par with everything else in the MCU. And in fact, there's actually quite a bit of good cinematography, even absent the CGI. Lots of good use of cameras, the way they focus on characters. The direction in general is pretty good. So production, it's an MCU film. It's pretty good. Probably the music is the part that doesn't really stand out. Now, the story is the part where it's really difficult to judge because, like I said, with aesthetics, things mix together. One of the things that you have to do with this movie is you have to bring every character from every franchise in to have some sort of thing to contribute to the movie. And that becomes increasingly difficult as you need to push some of these, the characters that are going to continue on, some of the side characters, as you have to kind of push them to the side or change their role in the greater, the greater thing in order to allow yourself to have the time to have the scenes necessary for Captain America and Iron Man's characters and Black Widow and Hawkeye to have all of their emotional moments. That's really what the main story is about. So this is a great example of the individual moments, the individual scenes, and their emotional impact. Emotion is more important than plot, really, right? If you're nailing the emotion, that's what matters. And you could even just watch these scenes kind of abstracted from the plot, which gives them meaning and coherency, and they would still have a big impact because you have all of these movies that lead up to them. That's what a lot of these scenes are for. So the main thing about the plot is that it was constructed in the exact way that needed to happen, not just to solve the problem of the previous Avengers movie, Infinity War, not just to solve the problem of half the people are dead, because that's the main thing. And I knew that they would do that. I predicted that they would undo all of the deaths in some way. And they did undo most of the deaths, those that Thanos actually did with his snap. And I knew that they were going to do that due to things outside the movie, which is that there's one Black Panther movie. It was a big hit. There's no way they're not bringing him back. One Spider-Man movie. There's no way they're not bringing him back. So just on those two things, you know that they're going to be bringing people back from the dead. In order to bring people back from the dead, that means time travel for the most part. Now, they did something a little bit different with time travel, which is rather than time traveling to stop Thanos, they come up with a little bit more of a contrived situation where they have to time travel and get the Infinity Stones. This is a setup for what amounts to a really high octane, I don't know what to call it, like super high production or high concept clip show. They travel back in time to the other movies. What what a better way to end the MCU than to literally travel to the other movies and re-experience those. And that's something that's intensely fan focused, and is necessary to provide that closure for the fans, I think. And I think it actually worked pretty well. Now, the setup for it, a lot of people might focus on, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Time travel, I've addressed this in other videos, time travel plots usually don't make sense. They're fun, they can be interesting, they can produce a lot of interesting plots and outcomes, but from a logical perspective, they usually don't make sense. So the way that they set this up is that, you have a problem with time paradoxes. So they just basically said, you can't create a time paradox, it's not possible. So when you travel back in time, and they actually have a big joke around the fact that their plot isn't really working, which is Ant-Man, the main driver of the plot. He starts basically referencing Back to the Future, which is something that a lot of Marvel fans ought to be familiar with, and just cinema fans, I suppose. Does all your knowledge of time travel come from Back to the Future? I think was one of the lines. And he gets a little bit embarrassed, and it's funny, but that's exactly what they base their system on. So if you go back in time, you can't change the past because your past, that past is your future. So essentially, they just say, time paradoxes don't happen. Now, then they go back on themselves pretty quickly. So at one point, they go back to get one of the Infinity Stones. I think the Hulk goes to get the Infinity Stone of Time before Doctor Strange has it. And then the Ancient One basically explains, this is another parallel universe you've created by time traveling, and so ours is not going to have the Infinity Stones, which are there to protect Earth. And so they kind of go back on themselves, and then they have to create a solution. Well, we'll just time travel back to the moment we took them, and we'll give them back after we use them to bring everybody back in our timeline, in our universe. And it all doesn't quite fit together, but it does produce in the entirety, and in fact, they actually violate this setup very late in the movie when they have Captain America go back in time and just live a normal life and become an old man. That violated the rules that they set up from the beginning, but it's not really about that, right? The time travel plot exists so that you can go back in time and see all the other Avengers movies. So they come up with a setup where they're going to go to these other time periods to fetch the Infinity Stones, bring them back to their time, and use the Infinity Stones to snap everyone back into existence. And it actually is a really, really good setup, I decided, for what needed to happen for this final Avengers movie, which is we needed to have all of the movies tied together. What better way to tie them together than to time travel to those different movies? So we get to go back to the first Avengers movie when Loki's captured, and there's even a weird thing where Loki ends up with the Tesseract and disappears. And you're like, well, I wonder what happens after that. That was kind of a weird thing, right? Are we going to have Loki return in some weird fashion? But anyway, it produces a lot of different comedy. It produces a lot of different tension, just like what you'd have with Back to the Future, which is why they reference it. It also produced an opportunity to have some really emotional scenes. So one of them which had a big impact on me. Believe it or not, things actually can have an impact on me, as analytical as I am, which is where Tony Stark is in the past recovering one of the Infinity Stones from a military base, and he runs into his father. His father was killed unexpectedly, and so it's a big emotional scene for Tony Stark, and Robert Downey Jr. really owns the scene. He's very, very good in communicating in a subtle way what he's actually trying to feel and communicate with his father, because he sees that as an opportunity that he really can't pass up. He really can't pass that opportunity up to see his father. Now, my father was killed very unexpectedly as well. So it's always an interesting idea, or an appealing idea, to be able to have a conversation with somebody that you never got to have that finality with. Not that when people die, you usually get to have some kind of finality, but when somebody has an illness that takes their life, you usually have a little bit of time, I guess, to make your peace. Not that I had any conflicts with my father, but you don't really get to say goodbye to somebody when they just disappear unexpectedly, when they go to work and then they don't come home, which is what happened to my father. So that had a big impact on me, for lots of reasons that are personal. But I think for a lot of fans, that would have a big impact just through the empathy of Tony Stark's character. That the loss of his father had a big impact on his life, and this was something, he's saying the things that he wanted to say to his father. Essentially, is now a fully developed, like Paragon-like character, a fully developed man, a fully developed character at the end of his growth arc, mature and able to understand and contextualize everything that's happened in his past. And one of the great things about Tony Stark's character in Endgame is we're at that conclusion. Not only is Tony Stark accepted his mistakes and made amends for them in a sense, he's made his peace, which is he's gotten married, he has a daughter, and he's made his peace with the failure to destroy Thanos. It's like, I made the peace that I failed at this, and it's time to move on and find more value as I go on. And so that kind of colors his decision to go back and fetch the Infinity Stones. Initially, he's reluctant. He doesn't want to. He doesn't want to because what he has in the current life is better than what he had prior to Thanos coming. He's matured and reached a peaceful conclusion. But he also understands that many other people have lost loved ones and have lost their lives, and he feels like he owes it to them, and also because he feels like he's the only person who can do it. That the mantle of responsibility still rests on his shoulders because of his immense genius and because of his power, and that's what he does. He solves this, they create a problem with time for him to solve, and they just do it through jargon. It's very... You understand that the jargon is there just to connect the dots and to have this little bit of character growth happen where Tony Stark understands that the responsibility is still on his shoulders. He hasn't reached the point where he can actually rest. And so he goes back in time and does all these things. And all of that setup serves to really juice the ending of the movie. And since I'm talking about Tony Stark, I'll talk about the ending of the movie. So at the end of the movie, Thanos travels forward in time from his timeline to steal the Infinity Gauntlet, and gets kind of mad with that power and decides he's going to destroy, basically raise all life down to, nothing and create new life that won't remember losing half of all life, right? And Tony Stark manages to end up with the gauntlet, and he does the snap that kills Thanos and his army. And as a result of that, they've set it up previous in the movie, starting with the beginning, where Thanos has destroyed the stones, using the stones, and it almost kills him. So due to the gamma radiation burst, it kills Tony. So because Tony dies at the end, we have an extra emotional attachment because we've seen him already reach the conclusion. He has things that are really worth losing in this one. It's not just, he hasn't really had a whole lot to lose prior to this. But he's married with a child, and so that is going to have a big impact. And of course, MCU fans, we're now looking at over 10 years of movies. A lot of them grown up have had children. So a lot of people in the audience understand the horror of dying when your child is young, when she's like 4 or 5 in the movie. So, I have a 3-year-old, and I have like a 6 week, she'll be 6 weeks old tomorrow, a 6-week-old daughter. And so that has a big impact on me as well. That's a big kind of juicy emotional moment to kind of wrench people's hearts. And what his wife says to him at the end is like, "It's okay, Tony, we'll be fine. You can rest," which is really the conclusion of his character arc. He feels like he's gone from a very selfish person to a person who has the weight of the world on his shoulders and can't handle it, and learns how to handle it, but really wants to rest, really wants to not have to have that responsibility to protect the world and protect others. And so when he finally reaches the end point where he's literally dying from his self-sacrifice, it's time for that character to rest, and that character will be put to rest. It's the end of Tony Stark, and it's the end of the MCU. The character that began the MCU is the character that ends the MCU. And it's a big emotional moment, and one that I think was really, really effective for me and probably for most fans as well. And so Tony Stark, I think, is like that's the behemoth of this. But there's also a great little arc with the conclusion of Captain America's character, where he's trying to live a normal life, even though he's had his normal life taken from him multiple times. It's the same thing. Super soldier serum turns you into a Superman, which is initially what you want, but then you realize that there's big consequences to that you have responsibilities that are attached to it. Like with great power comes great responsibility, which is Spider-Man, Sam Raimi thing. And so when we get through that, at the end of the movie, he goes back in time and lives a normal life. So he goes back in time. Presumably, he marries the woman that he loved and gets to have his rest too. And he does that in a way that he can't really be forced to continue onward. It's not as emotional. It's not nearly as emotional as Iron Man dying with a daughter, but it's a good conclusion for him. I think a lot of people, talking to fans online, I think a lot of fans didn't like that conclusion for Captain America, but I thought it was totally appropriate because part of his conflict is really just letting go of the fact that he can't have what is normal. And likewise with Black Widow and Hawkeye, the conflict is again over this draw of a normal life, like having to or being able to stop being a superhero to live a normal and appropriate family life. That's what Hawkeye has been doing, and the movie starts with that. It starts with a really emotional moment where his whole family gets snapped out of existence, and that's a horrible thought, right? That like your whole family would just disappear like the rapture, and you'd be left behind. And so we get treated to a couple scenes with Hawkeye where he turns into a bit of an anti-hero, a bit of a Punisher-like anti-hero, where he is killing criminals, nondescriptly. And we do that a little bit through some indirect exposition. You have Black Widow tracking him, saying like, oh, he killed all these cartel members. He's killing these Yakuza members. And at the same time, I'm wondering, like, half the people got snapped out of existence. It didn't really improve things. There's still crime and all these other kinds of bad things. So Thanos' plan was even dumber than I thought, maybe. And so Black Widow goes and finds him, and the way that she finds him is actually one of the dumbest connections I've seen in the MCU, which is he's killing Yakuza members with a sword, with this weird ninja toe sword thing he has. And Black Widow's standing in the rain with an umbrella behind him, and he's just like, hi. And I'm just like, really? Like, that's how you're gonna approach this violent killer, just like nonchalantly with an umbrella? And how'd you find him in the rain like that? It's bizarre. Like, it's a very bizarre meeting. But I know why they did it. It's because they just needed to have a scene with some tension where they would meet, and they just didn't really think about, having to do a whole bunch of extra writing to explain how they're gonna meet. But they meet. Their arcs conclude with trying to get the Soul Stone, which they meet Red Skull on this foreign alien planet. And just like with Thanos had to sacrifice his daughter in order to get the Soul Stone. One of them has to die. So one of them has to die to get the Soul Stone. And that's a really good conflict to set up if you're going to kill off characters and provide some closure, which is that somebody has to make the sacrifice. Now, Hawkeye originally is like, I'm going to make the sacrifice. I have no reason to live. And she's like, no, you do have a reason to live, because if we're successful, we'll bring your family back. And so in the end, Black Widow's the one who basically kills herself, and Hawkeye's very upset about it. And he's upset about it because he has a lot of guilt attached to the things he's done since his family died. He's been like a relentless killer of criminals, whereas Black Widow has been trying to save the world in essence. But she sees the potential for Hawkeye to have what she couldn't have, and this is something that was expressed in the first Avengers movie. She's like, she couldn't really have a family because of who she was, which by the way upset a lot of feminists, and Joss Whedon got like huge amounts of Twitter harassment from just like that line, that it was anti-feminist somehow. I thought it was a very humanizing and appropriate line. So you have a conclusion to that sentiment from that first Avengers movie. She wants him to be the one who goes on because he has the potential for this normal life, this life of rest. And indeed, that's what he's gifted with once they're able to successfully bring everybody back into existence. And the movie has this pretty good little climax where Hulk, because he's because he's a result of gamma radiation, is able to snap everyone back into existence. And through that provides basically a repeat of the final battle from the first movie. Everybody comes through the Doctor Strange portals, like the Wakanda army. Everybody pours through to fight Thanos, and it's still not enough, just like it wasn't in the first movie. But what changed, just kind of like how you get to do it over again. That was one of the things. You get to do it over again. That's the whole thing about time travel. Tony's able to snap Thanos out of existence and win with that. And so that's basically the story, and that's the way that the story is intended to have the effect, is the conclusions of the arc of those 4 characters. Otherwise, all the other stuff is just references that are put in. Now, Thor is the last character I'll mention. Thor is a fat alcoholic in despair. And a lot of people did not like Thor being a fat alcoholic in despair, but in the MCU, Thor is a comedic character, and he always has been, up to and including Thor 3. Even in the first movie, the comedy is more about him being a fish out of water. By the third movie, he's just a comedic guy as a result of that. So the fat Thor having to recover from depression, I actually had no problem with that, right? It just kind of humanizes him a little bit. He has no reason to continue fighting. He has no reason to lead half of the Asgardians that have had their city destroyed and are living as like Norwegian fishermen or something. And so he spends his days playing video games and drinking beer as an immortal with some aliens, right? And that's it. And so he has to essentially find his purpose again. And that's his character arc through the movie, and that's the conclusion of his character arc coming out of Thor 3 and finally ending with this movie. He failed to defeat Thanos. He gets another shot at the end of the movie. Being overweight does not stop him, and he also has massive regrets. And so part of his time travel is he gets to go back and talk to his mom again. So we have Tony Stark going back and talking to his dad. We have Thor going back and talking to his mom. And Thor already got to talk to his dead dad, so we have him go back and talk to his dead mom. So again, the time travel plot is serving the emotional release that's necessary for these characters. Thor's arc is less impactful than the Tony Stark one for sure, but it probably has a lot of meaning for some fans. And like I said, I didn't find Thor's comedy relief off-putting at all. I find him a pretty comedic character, and I rather like Chris Hemsworth playing the comedy of Thor. I think it works, and I actually enjoy it. So that's the story in a nutshell. There's a lot going on there. People are like, it's a little slow starting. It's really not about the action. It's not about the action except for that last final climax. It's really about juicing up the action and getting everything there. It's about giving everybody, a character moment from the past movies, and really about providing the final character closure for all of those. So it's really focused on character, not so much on plot. The plot exists just to allow the characters to do what they need to do and conclude everything. Likewise, they don't spend any time explaining the setting, and they spend very little time explaining the connections of the plot. It's mostly jargon to try to explain that they just are able to do the next part of the plot. We're able to time travel now. And the differences between the jarring settings, they just don't worry about that. It's like, hey, you've seen all of the MCU movies. We don't need to spend time doing exposition for you. It's all going to be about emotional moments and action, and that's what the movie's about. So the general effect as a result is actually pretty good if you look at it in that context. And of course, as a person who's seen all the MCU movies and enjoyed most of them, I really enjoyed Endgame in that context. I think it really worked well. And it'll be interesting to see what happens after this. I just don't know. I'm not super interested in seeing MCU movies after this because I'm like, I just don't know how they could do anything after this closure. It seems very complete. So anyway, let me know what you think down below in the comments. I know this is one of my longer analysis videos, but it's important to think about this from a writing perspective, that the emotion is more important than the details of the plot. And that's a lesson that I definitely learned from this movie. I also learned that characters, when it comes to things with franchises, I've known this for a while, it's the characters that matter. Characters are everything. It's why people don't like the Star Wars sequels. It's because the characters are not good. It's not just that the old characters that people loved haven't come back in a good way. It's that, obviously destroying the legacy of Luke Skywalker makes people feel bad, but the new characters just you don't have an attachment to. Likewise with the prequels, the characters there are just not as lovable as they are from the original trilogy. So if you're going to focus on anything and you're doing something that encompasses more than one work, the plot, obviously the plot, you should try to make your plots good, but having those emotional scenes with characters, having character development, and creating characters that the audience likes and gets attached to is probably much more important than executing a really good plot. In fact, it's as you have more things, if you're writing a book series or you're going to do anything that uses the same character, a comic book series or creating a comic book character, it's so much more important to nail the character than to nail the specifics of the plot. And we can see that with this movie. It's really just about character. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Newest book is it's not Conan. I was looking at that. It's Crown of Sight. This is a 2-hour read, so you could read this in less time than it would take to actually watch Avengers Endgame. And then, of course, you can also check out my older books, Murmos, a Blood Drinker, if you like bloody samurai fiction, and Water of Awakening. This is first high fantasy novel in the Eternal Dream series. This one is kind of a side story. So you'll see if you check those out. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time. Have a great one.